Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons, Chapter 12. Claude Hart Harris wrote from his house at Chiswick Mall a few days later in reply to Flora's letter. He knew the hawk monitors. Papa was dead. Mama was a darling old bird whose hobby was higher thought. There was a son who was easy on the eye but slow on the uptake, and a healthy sort of daughter named Joan. He thought he could arrange 4 invitations for Flora, if she was sure she wanted them. Would it not be a rather tiresome affair? But if she really wanted to go, he would write to Mrs. Hawk Monitor and tell her that a friend of his was in exile on a farmhouse at Howling, and that she would love to come to the ball and bring her girl cousin and 2 young men. He, Claude, would of course be charmed to partner Flora, but candidly, Seth sounded pretty squalid. Need he come? Squalid or not, said the small, clear voice of Flora, 50 miles away, for she thought she would answer his letter by telephone, as she was in a hurry to get the affair arranged. He is all we can find, unless we have that Mr. Mybug I told you about. I would really rather we did not have him, Claude. You know how dreadfully intelligent people are when you take them to dances. Claude twisted the television dial and amused himself by studying Flora's fair, pensive face. Her eyes were lowered and her mouth compressed over the serious business of arranging Elfine's future. He fancied she was tracing a pattern with the tip of her shoe. She could not look at him, because public telephones were not fitted with television dials. Oh, yes, we certainly don't want a lot of intelligent conversation, he said decidedly. I think we will rule out the Mybug. Well then, I will write Mrs. Hawk Monitor today and let you know as soon as I hear. Or perhaps I had better ask her to send the invitations directly to you, shall I? And so it was arranged. Flora came out of the post office at Beershorn into the pleasant sunshine, feeling a little ashamed of her schemes. Claude had said Mrs. Hawk Monitor was a darling. Flora was planning to palm off Elfine on the darling's only son. She strained her imagination, but found that it refused to present her with a picture of Mrs. Hawk Monitor welcoming Elfine with joy as a daughter-in-law. Mrs. Hawk Monitor's hobby might be the higher thought, but Flora felt sure she would be practical enough when it came to the question of considering a wife for Richard. She would not be sympathetic in spite of her learnings with Elfine's artiness. Elfine would have to be transformed inside and out before Mrs. Hawk Monitor could consider her suitable. And even if the transformation were made, Mrs. Hawk Monitor could not possibly approve Elfine's family, who indeed could approve of such figures of rugged but slightly embarrassing grandeur as Micah and Judith. And the Starcatters themselves would be sure, when the engagement was announced, to kick up one hell of a shine. Difficult times lay ahead. But this was what Flora liked. She detested rows and scenes, but enjoyed quietly pitting her cool will against opposition. It amused her, and when she was defeated, she withdrew in good order and lost interest in the campaign. She had little or no sporting spirit. Bloody battles to the death bored her, nor did she like other people to win. But it was no fun to fight a darling. Flora herself, had she been 65, and Mrs. Hawk Monitor would have felt most bitter toward a girl who planted an Elfine in the midst of a quiet country family. There was only one way of soothing her tiresome conscience. Elfine must be transformed indeed. Her artiness must be rooted out. Her mind must match the properly groomed head in which it was housed. Her movements must be made less frequent, and her conversation less artless. She must write no more poetry, nor go for any more long walks, unless accompanied by the proper sort of dog to take on long walks. She must learn to be serious about horses. She must learn to laugh when a book or a string quartet was mentioned, and to confess that she was not brainy. She must learn to be long-limbed and clear-eyed and inhibited. The first 2 qualities she possessed already, and the last she must set to work to acquire at once. And there were only 27 days in which to teach her all these things. Flora walked down the high street toward the place where the buses start. where the buses started, planning how she would begin Elfine's education. She looked at the clock on the town hall, which said 12, and realized that she had half an hour to wait for a bus. It was a Saturday morning, and the town was full of people who had come in from outlying farms and villages to do their shopping for the weekend. Some of them were already waiting for the bus, and Flora walked across the marketplace, prepared to wait with them. But then she became aware that someone, a man, was trying to attract her attention. She was very properly not looking at him, when something in his appearance seemed familiar to her. He looked like a Starkadder. There were so many of them that one of her minor worries was a fear of not recognizing one when she met him in the street. Sure enough, it was Harkaway. He had just come out of the bank, and into which he had been paying the weekly takings of the farm. In a second, Flora recognized him and said, "Good morning," with a bow and a smile. He returned her greeting in the Starkadder manner, that is, with a suspicious stare. He looked as though he would have liked to ask her what she was doing in Beershorn. She decided that if he did, she would undo the parcel of pale green silk she carried and shake it in his face all down the high street. Harkaway stopped in front of her and outmaneuvered her in advance of the bus. "You a long way from Woolham," he muttered. "So are you," retorted Flora. She was rather cross. "Aye, but I have business to do in Beershorn every Saturday. I comes down every Saturday morning in the year with Viper," and he jerked his head toward the large and disagreeable beast, which Flora now observed anchored to a buggy a little way farther on. "Indeed, I came by bus." A slow, secret smile crept into Harkaway's face. It was wolfish, ursine, vulpine. He softly jangled some coins in his pocket. He seemed as though bathed in some secret satisfaction of his own. This was because he had driven down to Beershorn in the buggy and saved the shilling his grandmother gave him every week for the fare. "Aye, the bus," he repeated drawlingly. "Yes, the bus. There isn't another one until 12:30. "Happen I might drive you home with me," he suggested, as Flora had meant him to do. Her disinclination to sit in the damp, smelly bus had fought with her disinclination to drive home with a Starkadder, and the bus had lost. Besides, she was always glad to see more of the private lives of the Starkadders. Harkaway might be able to tell her something about Urk, who was supposed to be going to marry Elfine. "That would be very kind of you," she said, and they moved off together to the buggy. She looked at him meditatively as the buggy passed rapidly between the hedges. She wondered what was his particular nastiness. She could hardly distinguish him from Urk and Caraway, Ezra, Luke, and Mark. Never mind, probably she would get them sorted out in time. She began to make conversation. "How is the well getting on?" Not that she cared. "'Tes all collapsed. 'Tes terrible." "Oh, I'm so sorry. What a pity. The last time I saw it was nearly finished. How did it happen?" "'Twas Mark. He and our Micah was argufying who should lay the last brick, and we all was standing round waiting to see which would hit the other first, and Mark, he pushed Micah down the well and pushed the bricks down on top of and laughed. We fair lay on the ground." Is Micah, is he badly hurt?" "Nay, Mark dived in after un and rescued un, but the bricks was lost." "A pity indeed," commented Flora. She was much surprised when Harkaway burst out, "Aye, 'tis a pity. There's summat called comfort would do better for a few bricks thrown at their heads. I name no names, but I know what I think." The coins jangled softly again in his pocket. The ursine smile touched his lips. "Who?" asked Flora. "Her, the old lady, my grandaunt. Her as has us all under her thumb." He jingled the coins again. "Ah, yes, my aunt," said Flora thoughtfully. She found Harkaway comparatively easy to talk to, nor did he seem unfriendly. "I cannot understand," she resumed, "why you do not break away from her. I suppose she has all the money." "Aye, and she's mad. If any of us was to leave the farm, she'd go madder yet. 'Twould be a terrible disgrace on us. We mum keep the head of the family alive, and in her right mind. There have always been, I know, said Flora hastily. Such a comfort I always feel, don't you? But really, Harkaway, I do think it is carrying authority a little too far when grown men are prevented from marrying. Harkaway laughed shortly. Rather to Flora's dismay, she feared he was going to make a farmyard joke, but he said, much more surprisingly, Nay, nay. Some on us is married right enough, but the old lady, she mun never see our women folk, or she'd go right away mad. The women folk of the Starkadders keeps themselves to themselves. They lives down in the village and only comes up when there's a gathering, or the old lady comes downstairs. There's Micah's Susan, Mark's Phoebe, Luke's Prue, Caraway's Letty, Ezra's Jane, him a bachelor, me, I've got me own troubles. Flora longed to ask what his own troubles were, but feared that the question might bring forth a flood of embarrassing confidences. Perhaps he was in love with Mrs. Beadle. Meanwhile, his news was so surprising that she could only stare and stare again. And do you mean to say that they all live down in the village? 5 women? 6 women, corrected Harkaway in a low voice. Aye, there's another. There's poor daft Rennet. Really? What relation is she to the others? She my own daughter to Micah's Susan by her first marriage, her marriage to Mark. And Mark, he's own half-brother to Amos, who is Micah's cousin, so 'tis rather confusing. Aye, poor Rennet. What is the matter with her? Inquired Flora rather tartly. She was exceedingly dismayed at the news that there was a whole horde of female Starcadders whom she had not seen. It really seemed as though her task would be too much for her. She would disappointed a Mark Dola 10 years ago. She's never married. She's queer like in the head. Sometimes when the sookbine hangs heavy from the passing wains, she jumps down the well. Aye, and twice she tried to choke Miriam, the hired girl. 'Tis nature, you may say, turned sour in her veins. Flora was really quite glad when the buggy stopped outside the farm. She wanted to hear more. She felt that she could not undertake to rescue Susan, Letty, Phoebe, Prue, Jane, and Rennet, as well as Elfine. Dash it, the women must take their chance. She would rescue Elfine, and as soon as that was accomplished, she would try to have a showdown with Aunt Ada. But beyond this, she would make no promises, and we will pause there.